task force group on Churches Together in England's enabling group and has been a delegate at a World Council of Churches Assembly.
Yeah, the World Council of Churches Assembly is in a few weeks' time.
She'll be there and she'll meet some of our dearly beloved colleagues who are also going. So Annika brings credentials and experience and background in the world of ecumenism, as well as everything else. Annika, it is a huge privilege that you have joined us all the way from Surrey, from a wedding, I think. You came overnight.
I came from Suffolk.
Suffolk.
Yeah. But I'm based in Southeast England at the moment.
You got all the way here, I think, in 24 hours. And we are so glad that you made it. Thank you. And I think the cameras are now working. So the people on Zoom, hello. Shall we give them a wave? Hallelujah. Over to you, Annika.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to finally come to Iona. I've heard lots about it from various people I know. So yes, my chapter in the book, the title was The Relevance of Mental Health to the Faith of Young People. Can you all hear me okay, by the way? Great. So I'm basically going to maybe give a brief summary of my chapter, ask myself some questions, which I'll be addressing. But actually the majority of this session is going to be like practical group work or things for you to do, which are like walk you through as we go along. So there'll be some questions for discussion, but also some exercises to do. And they're all optional. So if you don't feel like you want to engage, that's absolutely fine. Do what you want to do in that space. Just have time to reflect, potter about a bit. Yes, whatever you want, really. Great. So yes, the chapter, so the relevance of mental health to the faith of young people. So within this chapter, I start by just providing some facts on mental illness. I also consider the topic of suicide. In the chapter, I weave in my own experiences, particularly about my testimony of how I became a Christian, which is closely linked in some ways to my mental health and what I was experiencing. And I kind of, describe testimony of God at work in my life at times of trouble, and the onwards journey with God within my personal experiences with my mental health going up and down at different points. I share my own experiences of good practices in church life. So mostly I'm talking, probably always talking from the perspective of the Church of England, as that is my main church experience. But I have been in different church settings over the years. So currently, well, I'm an Anglican, but I'm actually also a Methodist. And I've been in discernment with the Church of England. I hope to be again, not currently, but actually I'm authorised as a worship leader with the Methodists. But I've also been in international Baptist churches and the 24/7 prayer movement. So I've had different church experiences. But I consider good practices in church life, also community life through Christian charities. But I also consider what can be improved in terms of behind the scenes within discernment, within ministry, and in congregations, particularly on how mental health and mental illness is talked about or reacted to within the church. I specifically focus on the importance of chaplaincy, inspired from my time spent with the chaplaincy charity working in schools in Ipswich called CYM. And I share some biblical passages of things which are connected to either kind of our emotional experiences or which can tie in to mental health and well-being. I focus on the interplay between Ignatian and Christian spirituality with practice of mindfulness, and consider like this a bit within my chapter and have particular scriptures that I'm focusing on, also within the Psalms, but also from Jesus's own life. And different passages in the Gospels. as these things kind of play a part in my life and my practices, as I consider things to do with well-being, resting, and just furthering and bettering my emotional, spiritual, and mental health, as I see them all tying together, including physical health. Everything is connected. We are human, we have all of these different needs, and when one of our needs isn't met, that can affect other needs that we have and our whole person and how we are in ourselves. So yeah, I talked a bit about why I wrote my chapter in the book launch, so I probably won't go into that too much. I've shared really why I was asked to by Victoria, and it's a personal and vulnerable thing to share on about mental health. So I was a bit like, I no, I'm not sure, but actually I'm glad I did. And it's my personal experience within all of the things I've experienced. So other people will have different experiences. We all have our stories to tell. And I think stories, relationship building, as Shamara was saying, and also listening are just so important. And it's how we get to know one another, and also get to know ourselves. I think when we ask ourselves questions about our relationship with others, our relationship with God, our passions, what gives us life, these are all things which contribute to understanding ourselves and the well-being of ourselves, but also the well-being of others. So I'll ask myself a question, because why not? So I kind of say in the chapter that the church cannot effectively evangelize to young people without ministering to their well-being. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what it looks like for the church to minister to young people's well-being. This isn't only applicable to young people. I think it can be applicable to all of us in different ways. And some things are the same probably for different contexts and different groups of people. Other things will be different, because it's an individual as well as like a corporate thing, like mental health and well-being. So most importantly, I think, is just providing a space for young people to talk, also feel comfortable in talking about things. It's just showing you care about the things that many young people are passionate about or which form part of their identity. So this could be environmental issues, social justice, equality and inclusion, which is all present in Iona community. You have those things you're talking about already, you're fired up by. You have the space available to listen, to talk about these things, to discuss and to pray. It's having activities in church, as I said, they feel able to connect with and use methods of communication they use. So it is thinking about things like social media, it's like TikTok, Instagram, all these different things that younger people, I'm also a millennial, so I'm not on all of the social media that those younger than us use. And interact with. But most importantly, again, what Shamara touched upon in her presentation was building relationships and trust through things like listening, taking the time to learn about the other person's stories, sharing a meal together, having a chill out space available in church to chat, just to find out what's going on for them in life. It doesn't need to be a big agenda, big topics of discussion. Is literally providing that space for listening. It's valuing young people both for who they are, but also enabling them in gifts and service to the whole church if they wish to be involved. Not all young people will do it. Also, when you're in a serving role, as I found, often then like how you're able to care for your well-being or how you're received by other people, it changes like how you feel or how I personally feel within church. And what I can get from church community, it looks very different for me personally. So listening, yes, it's a skill that needs learning. So in the end of my book, I shared end of my chapter, not my book, haven't written one of those yet. I kind of focus on this question, how are you? A very simple question, but either we like ourselves, find it difficult to honestly answer that question. I mean, it's finding the people and the places you feel safe in. I think it's important that you kind of choose the people perhaps you feel most comfortable talking to, particularly of sharing about very vulnerable topics. And within like mental health, mental illness conversations, it can be a very vulnerable topic. It is about that careful discernment, but it is also about being able to share a little bit, so it will encourage other people to share as well, but crucially having the time to listen. So I shared that like in my chapter, and as I said on Monday, I was reflecting about what I'd shared, and I'm like, yes, it's still very much needed. So from personal experience in my church community, I'm often felt, I don't know if it's because I've become a worship leader, I was serving in quite a lot of ways before, but that people ask me to do things in the church, but they don't ask so much, how are you? And often these things aren't even asked together, or if there's time to ask the question, how are you? People don't actually have the time to listen or to respond. It's just a kind of, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Okay, get on with whatever you're doing. Can you do the prayers? Can you do this? Can you? Okay. So I found it difficult in the last few months in my church, just to talk to people. And it gets harder then, I feel, if people do have things going on for them in their lives to share anything, because you haven't just had the simple interactions first and got to know people. So I want to do a bit of a quick exercise, just checking time. Yeah, okay, so it'll be like 2 minutes. So it's a listening exercise. So I don't know how we are in groups, but if you can go in like a pair, that would be great, a free if there's an odd number in groups. And just, I want you to share something for one person share for 1 minute, something which is important to them. The other person will listen and then reflect back what you've heard, what the other person has said. So you're not wanting to have a conversation, you are just there to listen to them. And then you will say back to the person what you just heard. So it's about practicing carefully the skill of listening, and then you can change over. Okay, does everyone understand? Yeah. It may be a bit more difficult for the people on Zoom, but okay, you're okay, great. I hope everyone had a chance to reflect back. Yeah. How did you find that exercise? Thank you. How did people find that? Was it a difficult process or was it easy? Is it okay? Great.
Time was too short.
Okay, so moving on. So I wanted to touch upon quickly what are the lessons for the church. A few quick points. I think just generally from my personal experience within the sermon process within the Church of England, I have been with 2 different dioceses and they've had very different responses to like mental health. So I just feel that I think it is happening that so within the Church of England, things can happen a bit differently in different areas of the country on how discernment works and how the process works in individual dioceses, whilst it's a national process. But I think it is a good thing that psychological assessments will be made compulsory feature because previously they weren't. So I'm hoping that there is going to be more like similar stuff happening, and it's going to be across all dioceses, and that people are going to get the same training across every diocese, so it's all the same experience. I'm really hoping, so in some dioceses they have this in terms of like ministerial well-being. If I do manage to become a priest, if the Church of England lets me at some point in future, I'm hoping that clergy and also perhaps some authorised lay ministers as well, they will get 2 days off on a regular basis. I think having the time to rest is really important, and actually for ministers to show by how they're resting to the church, the rest of their congregations, that is such a vital part. You know, Jesus rested, the seventh day in creation was given for rest. So it's really important for ministers to be able to model that so their church communities can learn from that. But at the moment, it's not achievable sometimes, or definitely not achievable, just because of all the burdens put on those in ministry. And I think this is something, which just needs to happen sooner rather than later. Obviously, funding is really needed to resource like our already struggling mental health services. I believe what churches, community spaces and chaplaincy can and do provide is valuable, as they provide, if it's done well, spaces for people to gather and talk, a listening ear, and just a chance to let people know they are not alone. So I do think there needs to be more investment in chaplaincy, particularly as that's meeting people in different community spaces. That's just really important. I think more churches should encourage more people to train in things like listening, to train up their pastoral teams further, and also just be aware of things like mental health first aid training. There's a lot of charities and organisations which offer it. Can start on basic things before building up to things like suicide prevention if that's needed within different communities. I think it's just encouraging people to feel comfortable about having these conversations is the basic starting point. So I want to share that I'm part of a charity called Emerge. So we are a Christian charity, and we're for young people in particular who are in hospital due to their mental health for reasons connected to that. We don't, like chaplaincy, don't talk about faith unless that's initiated by a young person. Sometimes is, sometimes not. We're just there as non-clinical people in the hospital, a listening presence. We can play games with the young person, we can do colouring, we can sit in silence. We're just there to listen if they want to share their story. And I think this kind of model, it's done in, you know, schools and things through chaplaincy. I think it's just really important that this can be rolled out further. And what churches can do is either give funding towards these projects or invite some of these charities which already exist in local communities but perhaps are not known about to talk in their churches to raise awareness and just share that knowledge and expertise so that more people are aware of that these things exist, because sometimes not enough is known about charities which are on offer for people to support them. So you don't need, I think sometimes people shy away from things to do with mental health. They think they need to be experts in it. They need to know everything. They need to have all the answers. You don't. You can start simply having the conversations, know where to signpost people to for further professional support, and just be a listening presence. So what else needs to be said on this topic? Like, I could have said much more than I did in my chapter. I would have liked to look perhaps more at neurodivergence and that unpack that a bit more. I think there's more discussions to be had about how churches work with partner agencies and more about how you embed mental health discussions and also about mental illness in church life. And yeah, I've said the bit about just being able to offer courses and having the space. Churches have great spaces to host some of these like talks for people and bring communities together. It's a great thing if you're thinking about humanism, like, you know, it is part of, I'd say, the church's mission to minister to people's well-being, to make sure people are feeling happy and supported in their lives and want to get to know them for who they are. And that's important to focus on their well-being as well. So it's just, yeah, just providing your church buildings and spaces to host these discussions or courses for people to come to. So that's enough talking from me. I now have some questions. There's quite a lot of questions, so just pick a few which chime with you perhaps to discuss. So So can I have someone to... Yeah, I have some questions. They will come up on the screen as well. But I also have some to give out. So there'll just be one for each group. So someone can facilitate some and just ask them. I'll give you a bit of time to discuss them. With their responsibilities. So they should be, you know, if they're creating the stresses and if those things, so for me, from my experience, for example, some of the stresses I felt is because I haven't felt always within the church, in different churches or just church generally as an institution, that the Equality Act is always adhered to in, yeah, as much as it could be. Let's say there are loopholes, and I've had a better experience and had far less stress in like interview situations, things like this in non-church contexts. And my hope would be it would be the other way around. So I think that if the church is like abiding by some of these things like the Equality Act, but just generally also listening to the people who are coming to them, creating like requirements for access, you know, asking these important questions to make, and just generally creating a culture which is welcoming, inclusive and safe for all, and taking on the feedback and not acting defensively, but making sure the offer is already there, not waiting for someone to come, which sometimes happens, that people don't feel welcome, don't feel included. But I think a lot of, not always, but sometimes if that stress is created, it's often to do around areas of equality, diversity and inclusion, and the welcome people receive within a context. So I think that's one of the ways, but I think it is important for institutions to also offer this support or to signpost people to support and people to be aware of that.
John Harvey, Glasgow Southeast. Excuse me, we're not standing up. As an example of what can be done through congregations, our Church of Scotland has partnered with the local Roman Catholic Church to set up, about 25 years ago, a project which offers help for well-being in general to refugees and asylum seekers and to school children in primary and secondary schools. And then more recently, a project, again, a charity, which works through music, of singing and playing musical instruments, specifically designed to help with well-being. Now, I know that's not specifically mental health, but it covers mental health. And through setting up these charities, it means that they can access funding. And funding is crucial for enabling staffing to happen so that these projects can be staffed continuously, one of them over a quarter of a century, to offer help in well-being in general to people in an inner city area of multiple deprivation through the church. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing. It's a really lovely example. Thanks.
Annika, can I just let the people who came in from the little group know that, or ask you, given that there's no formal lunch at 1 o'clock, are you okay that we carry on till 1:45 with the session? Thank you.
Can someone, Shamara or Victoria, can you hand out these cups, one to each group? Thanks. I think they're all being handed out. Can everyone take I mean, again, if you don't want to participate, you don't have to. If you want to participate, please just pick up a raisin from the glass. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to be doing a very short mindfulness exercise. As some of you may have guessed, I gave out a raisin. If you've done mindfulness before, it's quite a popular thing. Sometimes it's done with chocolate. I would have loved to have brought lots of chocolate, but my ability to cut chocolate up into lots of different pieces would be hilarious to watch. So I've saved you from that. So yeah, what I want you to do is just take the raisin in your hand gently. So just focus on it right now. Focus all your attention on this raisin and just consider it like it's a really precious thing. Consider the textures of it in your hand. Feel its skin. Think about the feeling. How does it feel to hold it in your hand? And how you're holding it. Are you holding it gently? Are you holding it very firmly? Just have a think about some of these questions. And as you're holding your raisin, recall how God supports you in your life and views you as precious and valued. Look at the raisin closely. If you need to bring it up to your eyes a bit closer to do that, do so. So each of these raisins which you are holding have similarities because they're all raisins, but they're also unique. You may see like there's particular numbers of wrinkles. You may want to count them perhaps. And I want you to consider, as you're looking very closely at your raisin, how each one of us is a unique creation from God. Though we share similarities with one another, we also are different and diverse, and we're glorious in our diversity, and all of us are needed. Now I want you to lift the raisin up to your ear. Just move it around in your hands. Listen to hear if you can hear if it makes any sound, what that sound is. If you're comfortable, now close your eyes. If you're not comfortable, just keep them open, that's fine. I want you to take the raisin to your nose and smell the raisin. Then open your eyes if you have them closed. And again, if you don't want to, you don't have to do this next step, but place the raisin on your tongue and just savor it there on your tongue for a moment or two. And when you're ready, if you desire to eat the raisin, considering again the texture as you're chewing it and the taste as you do so. So this was a very quick mindfulness practice designed to focus our attention on the very simple act of eating a raisin and also to stimulate our senses. And it's because sometimes we can miss out on things, as naturally we often do some things in autopilot, or we do a few things at once. We can miss out on paying attention to the very small things in life, which can give us a lot of joy as we're going about our daily lives. So you can just reflect in your own time, maybe at a later point, just anything which struck you from that exercise, may be familiar to a lot of you already. But yeah, it's just an interesting one to do from time to time. Okay, so now we are going to, it may be a very different way of doing Lectio Divina, but I basically just have a passage which will be coming up on screen, hopefully. And, all right, is it loading? Cool. I'd like you to read the passage aloud twice. So just in your groups, I think maybe you can pick 1 or 2 people to read it, and just have a pause in between reading the passage. And then I have some questions to consider the passage. We'll see if it turns on screen or not. Great. I hope people can see the passage okay. If you can't, if you have your phone, or I don't know if someone will have a Bible, but it's 2 Corinthians 12, chapter 12, verses 9 to 10. So yeah, in your group, just get someone, elect someone, or you can read it silently if you so wish, to read it aloud twice. Just have a short pause in between reading the passage. And then once you've done that, I have some questions which will come up on the screen. So the questions are: what touched you from this passage? Were there any words or phrases which jumped out at you? How did the passage make you feel? So you can either reflect on those by yourself, or if you want to share in your group, you can. And then from that, after you've had a chance to focus on those kind of questions, speaking to you personally, using the passage, and if you want any others, but we don't have much time, which come to mind, to just reflect on the themes of resilience, faith, and mental health. And if you see them demonstrated here, then what you think it means to be resilient, and does having a faith make a difference? There's quite a lot of questions, so I appreciate we don't have time to focus in depth on them all. You have probably like 8 minutes. But yeah, please, yeah, do continue discussing later on and share your wisdom with one another. So to finish, or just before we finish, I wanted to share, so this book, which I picked up again from my bookshelf, was given to me when I was going through quite a rough patch just before graduating, because I love Psalm 27, and it's all the meditations in this book. So it's called A Shelter in the Time of Storm, Meditations on God and Trouble. And they're all like inspired by different bits of Psalm 27. So I just thought I'd read, there's an amazing one on rest as well, highly recommend this book. But there's also one I'm going to read now called Why Bother? And it is based on Psalm 27, verse 13. It says, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And this is so vital for me, because actually I say in my chapter, I think I do anyway, that one of the verses which really pulled me in to becoming a Christian, and which still jumps out at me, one which I'm still trying to live out, is John 10:10, about Jesus saying, I have come so that they may have life, and life to the full, and just reflecting on what that means for us in our journey with God, in our lives, in the world. So, okay, enough from me. So why bother? I consider the brokenness of the world and I think, why bother? I look at the corruption all around me and I cry, why bother? I wonder at my inability to live with my neighbour and I ask, why bother? I face my war with sin inside and outside and I ponder, why bother? I look at the problems of the culture around me and I lament, why bother? I scan my world, broken by disease and misuse, and in sadness say, why bother? I consider the statistics of violence and abuse, and I think, why bother? I am assaulted with the reality of endless wars between nations, and overwhelmed say, why wonder? I am defeated by temptation's power and cry, why bother? I ponder how good is called bad and bad good, and in frustration say, why bother? I search for hope like a parched man for water, but end up thinking, why bother? I look to myself and see weakness and want, and in grief say, why bother? Perhaps I should live for leisure and comfort and give into why bother? Maybe I should exist for the here and now and forgetting forever say, why bother? I am tempted to live for power and control and for greater things say, why bother? Perhaps personal pleasure in the here and now is what it's all about. Why bother? But in exhaustion, I look up and not around, and I say, why bother? Why bother? Because you are, and you are good. Why bother? Because you dispense goodness and grace. Why bother? Because you bring life out of death. Why bother? Because you have a plan and it will be done. Why bother? Because I have been welcomed into your kingdom of life. Why bother? Because I am always with you. It is true that my eyes don't always see and my heart isn't always confident. It is true that darkness overwhelms me and fear leaves me weak. But you come near. You remind me once again that I can be confident because you were unwilling to say, why bother? And I just think that encapsulates kind of what you are and who you are as Iona community. You're grappling with some really big questions. You're speaking truth to power. You're for justice in lots of areas, in different areas of social justice. And it's the same with like the book, Young, Woke and Christian. Hopefully you've discovered that as we've been journeying along with it and reading the chapters, that there's a lot of disappointments. There's a lot of things which can pull us down. But ultimately, we have hope. We have hope in God. We have hope for the world and the kingdom, which is already happening here now, and we're part of that. And it's just how we take that forward in our lives, in our words, in our actions towards one another. Thank you very much.
Annika, thank you. You have given us hope. You have shown us yet again how not just the book, but those of you who wrote in the book are our dear companions. And I hope we can stay companions together in the next, wherever the life that we lead now takes us. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking we are probably a community that prides ourselves in talking about things that are taboo and a bit risky. We have a process of accounting for the use of our time, money, resources, and the earth's resources. I'm not sure, certainly in my experience, that we have really ever gone to the place where you took us into a conversation in the gentle, compassionate, and really powerful way that you took us into a conversation about mental health and well-being. And I think it's a place we need to go as a community. So thank you for taking us there and beginning the journey. So friends, it gives me huge pleasure now to introduce you to Shamara Fletcher, who is going to be our speaker this morning, and followed then by Annika just after the coffee break, which will be a very brief coffee break. Get your coffee, bring it back. Shamara, you are, I'm going to read it from you to get it right, the Principal Officer for Pentecostal, Charismatic and Multicultural Relations at Churches Together in England. It is our huge privilege to have you here on Iona with us. We look forward to your input.
Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? Amazing. It's so great to be with you as the Iona community, and I especially want to thank Victoria for the invite and for the amazing book. It was her concept. And also to Ruth and all of you for being willing to listen to what I have to say this morning. So the title of the talk is Racial Inclusion and Injustice Starts with Me. Unlikely leaders and building unlikely relationships. Now, I was originally asked to speak about homelessness because that's the premise of my chapter, but I did a lot of talking at the author's event and just listening to you and the vision that you want to do going forward, I decided to talk about racial inclusion. I will touch on unlikely leaders because that's also in my chapter from the homeless work. And most importantly, how we build unlikely relationships. Oftentimes we want different communities to interact and engage with our programs, but we can't do that without building genuine relationships. I'm going to give a framework for how you can potentially do that. And just to give you a structure, I'm going to speak to you for about 10 minutes. Do feel free to write notes. Also push back. I'm the queen of nuance. I don't need everyone to agree with me. So it's great to have that dialogue. And then you'll do some group work. Is that okay? Amazing. Okay, so racial inclusion starts with me. When it comes to racial justice and inclusion, there are many meta-narratives, ideologies, and frameworks that we can analyze. For instance, deconstructing whiteness. I'm sure you've heard that, particularly after George Floyd's murder. Interrogating race, deconstructing the legacy of colonialism. And one of the writers or narrators of this narrative, I really do recommend that you get this book if you haven't got it already, is Religion After Whiteness. I'm just going to read a few points of how he describes whiteness, just so that you understand that we're not going to center this whole talk around whiteness. We don't need to do that, but it's good just to give you the framework of where we'll be going. So he says, whiteness does not refer to people of European descent, but to a way of being in the world, and seeing the world that forms cognitive and affective structures able to seduce people into its habitation and its meaning making. So we're talking a lot here about narrative, how we experience the world. That's what he would argue whiteness is. He also says that whiteness was formed in the colonial theatre. With a convening power unprecedented in the world, not only in its scale, but also in its utter disregard for the convening abilities of other peoples. So it suggests that there are other people beyond whiteness in the world. There has been empires before. I even understand that Iona was raided by the Vikings. Is that correct? I love the Vikings. I've been watching the series on Amazon, and when I saw that, I was just so excited. Sorry, that's a side note. In the hands of the Europeans, the good of convening joined the bad of imperialism. And from it came a vision of the universal controlled by Europeans. So what he's trying to say is that whiteness joined with Europeans. He's not saying that Europeans are whiteness of itself. Yeah, only they could gather the world, and only they understood the gathering of the world. Europeans not only exploited the differences among people, but they also created boundary identities between people. So for instance, geographic, physical, cultic, sexual, and theological. So it's about that construction of meaning, of narrative. That's what was happening in that imperialistic pursuit. And I'll send you this afterwards so that you can read it for yourselves. So I said, yes, it's really great to look at the meta-narratives, some of the frameworks that construct race, what some of the writers are thinking about. But today I really wanted to challenge us on a personal level. It's great to look out there, but sometimes we need to address, is there actually racism, prejudice, or discrimination going on within me? Do I actually have some thoughts that I wouldn't want to say out loud? Because that's the more challenging work, actually. We can get lost in the academia and we can put our concepts onto other people. It's much more challenging to look within. So to do this, I'm going to be looking at the Apostle Peter. I love exegesis. I love looking at scripture to help us with this concept today. And his story really highlights for us, before we can tackle injustice of racism in mainstream society, let me look within. So the recent events of the COVID-19 global pandemic, it's exposed a national and global underbelly of polarity, division, and civic unrest. Would you agree with that? Or is it just me? That's what, okay, good. I'm on the same page. There has been a resurfacing of alarming health, race, and class inequalities. The racially motivated murder of George Floyd, who saw that? Yeah. Of Breonna Taylor. Do we not? Oh, I'm so glad you know that, because often her story gets lost. Patriarchy, but anyway, we won't go there. So racism, prejudice, and discrimination has also reared its ugly head in the UK, both in the past and the present, and particularly in the divisive context of Brexit, whatever side of the poll you ticked. We also have seen racism in the past. So I'm a millennial, I'm 29. And Britain had its own George Floyd in Stephen Lawrence. So it's not an American problem, actually. And we see this overwhelm, lethargy of disillusionment, particularly with young people across the world who are just tired of the injustices that we are seeing. Justice is truly crying from the streets. However, I argue that the quest for racial justice, peace, equality, and equity cannot exist without crossing the bridge of justice. And today I want us to look at two bridges. This is the bridge of personal prejudice and crossing the bridge of fear and silence. So crossing the bridge of personal prejudice. The stain and sin of racism, discrimination, and prejudice should not reside in the attitude and heart of Christians in the 21st century. If you think it still does, please raise your hand. And before I go into the speech, I should also say that racism, discrimination, and prejudice, they're often used interchangeably, but they are different things, even though they do interlink. So prejudice deals with the negative attitude someone has towards a particular group. Discrimination is when these negative attitudes are acted upon. And then racism goes beyond hurt feelings or I have a bad attitude towards you, but it's when a system of power has been put in place through either laws, structures, to uphold the attitude and to uphold the behaviors. So that's why racism is so dangerous. It goes beyond, oh, I don't like you because I have a preconception of your community. It's when I can write to my MP or a policy is being put in place and I can actually stop your flourishing in life. So just a really short discussion point, just for 1 minute. According to Robert P. Jones, he's the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in Christianity. He argues that white Christians are consistently more likely than whites who are religiously unaffiliated to deny the existence of structural racism. That's what he says. So just for 2 minutes within your groups, just discuss that. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I love the people who dissent. We can get into dialogue. I don't need you to agree with that. But yeah, just for 2 minutes, just discuss his finding. Do you agree or not? And then we'll come back. Thank you.
Don't Stubbing, Swiss Midlands. Leave you with a little phrase. Denial is the lifeblood of racism.
Oh, I need to put that on a t-shirt and wear it. Thank you. I love that. Okay, so we're going to move on, but there will be more time for discussion, so you won't have to hear me all the time. Now, I'm going to look at the scriptures now. Prejudice, discrimination, and racism isn't a new issue. It was even experienced by the one we worship, Jesus, who was a member of an occupied and oppressed Jewish community under Roman imperialism, and which was perpetrated amongst his disciples, in particular, Peter. Now, Peter was a church leader who earned his theological stripes in Judaism. And if that wasn't enough, he even spent time with Jesus in the flesh, had walked on water, and basked in the forgiveness of denying Christ. Yet he still had a narrow, prejudiced, and discriminative attitude towards the Gentiles, which fluctuated depending on the crowd and its level of importance. We can learn a lot about God's attitude towards racism, discrimination, and prejudice through Peter's story. God was not interested in all of Peter's accolades, church accomplishments, or even that he would establish a global church movement, and directly called out Peter, making it clear, do not call any man clean or uncommon. This reveals a universal gospel that was radically inclusive and an intolerance for any form of antagonism towards the advancement of different people coming into communion with God, and most importantly, flourishing. We can be in relationship, but what is the quality of that relationship? The recording and correction of Peter's attitude shows that it is more than possible for Christians and the church to be prejudiced, and that it's not acceptable to perpetrate prejudice behind theology, culture, church establishment, willful ignorance, and positions of power. Peter's correction and revelation also provides hope for the perpetrators of prejudice and discrimination, that change is possible for you too, and that God is also lovingly concerned about the condition of your heart, because racism, discrimination, and prejudice actually blocks you from seeing the image day in others. Racism isn't just about those who are being oppressed, it's about those who hold those faulty attitudes. You are not living in your full humanity either. There's a deliverance that takes place both ways. Which leads to the second bridge that needs to be crossed, which is the bridge of fear and silence. As my good friend here, I will give you the patent rights for that t-shirt, because it's absolutely imperative what you've just said, that denial, that fear and silence breeds injustice. If you look at any abuse case, silence breeds abuse. It feeds off silence. So in the face of racial injustice, do we have the confidence and determination to resist the temptation to remain passively silent and maintain the status quo in our society and church communities? Well, Jesus condemns the religious leaders of the day for that complacency. Matthew 23:23 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." Now, I found it really interesting that Jesus didn't hold to account the politicians of the day, didn't hold to account the tax collectors, didn't hold to account the policymakers, but explicitly speaks to the religious leaders of the day. Jesus's condemnation also challenges Christians, the church, and most importantly, its leaders, to take seriously their responsibility to implement an inclusive environment where all equally flourish and challenge injustice in the world. And what better than the Iona community, where you have a rule of life for justice? which raises the critical question, what are we focusing on? Are we solely focusing on our shiny 6-point church growth strategies, how we can sustain our church, ecumenical and Christian cultures and income, whilst neglecting the weightier concerns of unjust laws, social ideologies like racism that deplete people's life? We're coming to a discussion, don't worry. Now, the impact of standing up and dealing with weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness is evident in Queen Esther. I love Queen Esther. In this story, oftentimes Vashti gets a really harsh time, you know, this rebellious woman, but maybe she just didn't want to be sexually objectified by the king. Yay. Anyway, that's a different sermon for a different time. You know, in Esther's life and timeless declaration, if I perish, I perish. Esther's decision to resist the temptation to remain silent saved generations from genocide and ethnic cleansing, motivated by prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Esther forsook her privilege, because that's the difference here. Sometimes you can use privilege, but it's much harder to put it down and share it. It's easier to say, I have privilege, than to give it away. So she forsook her privilege, societal benefits, and then used that power to benefit nations. And she called out corrupt, racially motivated government policies of her day. Do we see any of that going on today? Flights to Rwanda, yay. And finally, as we resist to neglect our responsibility to challenge and tackle racial injustice in the church and wider society, whilst living in the tension of the already and not yet, because the world isn't perfect, we have to understand that, I leave you with this question, or a couple of questions, to reflect on. Kwame Anthony Appiah says, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words that evoke structures of oppression, exploitation, and brute physical threat can break souls. What does this mean to you? Like Peter, why is it possible to love and follow Jesus and give your life, give everything, your money, your finances, your time, but still not love and show equality to all his children? When you deal with and uproot any attitudes of racism, discrimination, and prejudice within yourself or your institution, what does your voice have the power to save, and what does your silence have the power to enable? And finally, is your environment inclusive for all races to experience the rich spirituality of the Iona community? So we'll give you 8 minutes to discuss this question. Okay, 10, I'll be kind, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together. Oh, just to give your feedback. So yes, over to you.
I'm going to come to you first because you're nearer.
Jennifer Blackledge, Manchester Associates Group, and we mainly answered the last one. And the major thing we talked about was translation of liturgy into various different languages. So not just like English, but like French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Mandarin, Japanese, all these, so that people can access the liturgy in their own language, whether it's because they come from that country or because they're second or third generation and want to reintroduce back into their culture. I think it's a very important thing, could actually spread our work, be more racially inclusive and ethnically inclusive and all that stuff. So yeah, translate the stuff.
Thank you. Yes, language is a barrier that can be removed to bring that inclusivity. Thank you.
Yeah, Colin Ball from West Midlands. I think we talked about the last question as well. And I think the Iona community has got a real problem. Apart from Yusuf, who's here, and Kaz, who isn't here, I think they are the only two members of the Iona community who are not skin color that I've got. That we've got Jimmy Calhoun who's coming in now, I think, new mega program from the States, which is fantastic. But we need to do something about it. And Neville, yeah. I don't know what we do about it, but I know that 35 years ago, Yusuf will remember, my then wife and I brought up two groups from Birmingham, one from Holy Trinity Sutton Coldfield, essentially a white middle class church, and one from Holy Trinity Birchfield, which was essentially mainly Afro-Caribbean. And there was a real tension the first couple of days because people could not accept the white folk like me. Well, I could accept because I knew it, but others couldn't accept that there was structural racism. But by the end of the week, we'd all embraced it and really gone back to energy. And the folk who came from Birchfield really valued and appreciated our spirituality. And I don't think that's happened again, mixed groups like that coming. Maybe it has. And I think we just need to do much more to make it happen. But I'm heartened that Jesus struggled with racism as well, the Sino-Phoenician woman, because he wasn't going to give her anything until she reminded him that, you know, we're all God's people, and then he relented. So yeah, we can do it.
Thank you for sharing that, because the next point we're going to look at how to actually build relationships with other communities. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yusuf Gojari from Edinburgh, East Lothian. So we discussed a couple of proposals as to what we could do about it as the community. I mean, the first thing I think is your presentation should be written up in the Coracle. It was outstanding presentation that you gave. I was really impressed by it, and it's just been very useful for me in the meta-narratives and everything else. Thank you very much for that. So my first suggestion is that we set up a CCN, and we discussed it here, and we'll be having discussions with Ruth at some point. But I thought of calling it challenging racism, and I've changed my mind. I think we should be calling it challenging white privilege in the community. And that's a question, that's about leveling up our conversation. So we're all at different levels of understanding in this. And there's no judgment as to where you are, what you're not doing or whatever. And I think it's more woke to be understanding white privilege. So I'd quite like to call it that. And that will be starting, hopefully, if everybody agrees or support is given later on this year. And I just want to read you something which I want to send to all family groups as a starting point to that. I'd like to discuss for yourself what is white privilege for you. And the article I'm going to send you is something which I've edited, but it's called White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. You might have come across it. I'll just read you one paragraph, if I may. I've come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets, which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. And she goes on to explain 30 examples of white privilege in her own daily life. And I think if we could, as family groups and individuals, start with that to make our own list, that would be a really good start to the process. So that's my contribution. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Amazing. So we are going to move on now for the sake of time, and you might want your coffee, so I won't keep you much longer. The gentleman in the lovely grey shirt just made such an amazing point, actually, that segues us into the next section of this talk. It's about relationship. You brought an Afro-Caribbean community here alongside your white community. There was tension at the beginning, but I imagine genuine relationship built, which then brought harmony. So oftentimes we think, oh, we want to diversify our spaces, but how? I don't know that group. How do I even, you know, venture and make relationship with them? So I'm going to give you a framework, and you can use it if it's helpful, and equally if it's not, don't use it. So yeah, we're going to talk about building relationships and the importance of building genuine relationships that doesn't instrumentalize people. Okay, so I'm going to use a community organizing framework. Who's heard of community organizing? Okay, good. And they give a framework for building public relationships, but I argue that you can use this within a church context because it actually helps you to unearth people's vocation or who they are as an individual. So community organizing would define relationships as when communities work together, the possibilities for positive change are endless. Community organizing is the work of bringing people together to take action around their common concerns and overcome social injustice. Community organizers reach out and listen, connect, and motivate people to build their collective power. When people are organized, communities get heard and power begins to shift, creating real change for good. Now, this applies to racial justice as well. When you start building community with other individuals, understanding where's the power imbalance within your own community, as well as wider society, and then change can happen. If someone just said, oh, come to my house, I'd probably go because I'm quite intrigued by things like that. But generally, people probably be like, I don't know you. Whereas if you've taken time to know somebody and then you invite them to your house, it's a much more organic relationship. Would you agree? So I argue before you even start to build relationship with others, you need to know yourself. You need to know who you are. What are you sharing with the other person? And how do you build that relationship that's not objectifying or instrumental? Or, I should bring you into my community because we need to diversify it. Is that the premise of why you want to build relationship, or do you actually want to know the person? Because I can guarantee you it's so much easier. You don't have to do the buy-in because I know you, I love you. Well, it takes me time to love people, but you know what I mean. So this is urgent, particularly if you want to make your spaces inclusive. And one of the tools that we do and use is the stick person. If you're familiar with community organizing, you've probably heard of this, but I like to experiment with methodologies and concepts and try and make them my own. And you can use this for the everyday person. So not just for social justice issues, but actually getting to know people. And these are some of the questions that you can ask. What are the most significant relationships in my life? What are the most significant institutions in my life? What are my central ambitions? What are the defining moments in my life? And how do I spend my time, energy, and my money? This is a framework for knowing who you are, because sometimes you realize, oh, I love people, but I spend all my time in my room. Something's not mathing. The math isn't mathing. So this framework really helps you to prioritize, what do I say I love and what am I actually doing? What do I need to change? Actually, I did that 5 years ago, but I need to pause that now. And then as you do this inner work, you then ask another person, their stick person. And that's how the interaction happens. I'm very, very, very mindful of time. So I'm going to give you the framework. I'm going to ask maybe to do this in your own time or spend a minute just looking at it for yourself. And then in your own time, do fill this out. And just to give you a quick example, I'll show you mine. So what are some of the most significant relationships in my life? My parents, my grandparents, siblings, university friends, and the Centre of Theology and Community. It's a really cool place. That's where I learned a lot about community organising and a lot of, yes, East London, please go. Angus Ritchie, he's amazing. I'll connect you, Ruth. I think he'd love what you're doing. What were some of the significant institutions? The Church of God of Prophecy, that's my home Pentecostal church. The Church of England. So I actually call myself now a Penty Anglican because I don't know. I don't know where I land, and that's okay because I'm an ecumenist, so I embody it. The University of Birmingham, and also Durham. That's where I did my degrees. And then De Vere Hotel. I did a lot of ladies retreats with my mom. She's a leader over the UK, and we used to just bring hundreds of women for healing. So you get the gist, right? You go through all those questions and answer that for yourself. So how do you then apply your stick person? We do this through what's called a one-to-one. It's not a management term. You're not interviewing somebody. You're not asking them to account for their work. It's none of that. It's literally just to share your stick person and for that person to share it with you. So setting up a one-to-one can be very awkward. I can give you some personal examples. I was in East London and I went to this gentleman and I said, oh, I'd love to meet for coffee and, you know, build relationship and know you. And he's like, oh, we're going on a date. And I was like, oh my God, no. So you have to think about how you introduce yourself for the one-to-one. But really and truly, it's just going up to an individual and saying, you know, I've worked with you a long time, or we've been in church together a long time, we're in the same community. I've seen you a lot, but I don't actually know you. It would be really great. I've learned this exercise to get to know you more and you to get to know me. That's a really great way of doing it. And it's unlike any form of communication. We have Twitter, lots of social media. We're very interactive, but they don't actually build relationship. You know, there's so many people that will follow me on Instagram and tell me what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks. I don't know them. So it can create this superficiality. But this is going to help you to go into depth. So for instance, you might say, oh, we want to engage more young people in the Iona community. I would advise, okay, have a one-to-one with the CEO of a youth organization and just get to know them, get to know what their objectives are, what your objectives are, and build genuine relationship. And the work will come from that. It's about putting people before the program. We don't create a program and then try and fit people in. You're spending too much time trying to get buy-in. What it is, it's a 30 to 45-minute conversation with another person. The agenda is the other person and yourself. So many times in relationships and interactions, people can just talk at you. And after 5 minutes, you're like, oh God, I need to have a lie down. Sorry, it's the truth. But it's interactive, it's reciprocal. It's about sharing about yourself as well. It's about sharing power. You want to hear their story, their important decisions, their hopes, and their ambitions. So I'm going to finish there now. And I'm just going to ask you for the next 5 minutes, just to really look at that paper. And if you have a pen, you can start to fill it out and really think about what's going on inside of you. Who are you? And then I want to set you a challenge to arrange to have a one-to-one with one person in the Iona community before you leave. It doesn't have to be 40 minutes, you know, you can make it 20, even if it's so after dinner, after prayers, wherever it is, even if it's walking on a pilgrimage, just to share your stick person with that person. You'll be amazed the treasures that lie within people when we actually go and dig them up. So for 5 minutes, just in silence where you are, just reflect on who you are, on your stick person. And then I'll open the floor for questions before handing over to Annika.
The Mac, and she spent a year trying to do that and failed at the end of the year and told me that she'd failed. And I realized that what we need is skilling up in the networks. For example, England has dioceses, they have black groups, they have minority ethnic workers, they have all these plethora of people in large numbers who may benefit from both the spirituality of Iona, spirituality of the community, and a benefit to youth and what they can, the communal life they can lead up here. I just wanted to know your view on whether that's even achievable, reasonable, appropriate, or in any way, shape, or form, and how the MAC might relate to that whole network that you belong to with the Pentecostals to achieve that end.
Well, it's interesting to hear, it would be interesting to hear, and we can speak afterwards, what she did or didn't do. You know, building that relationship is important. So for instance, I'm here now this week. I've built relationship with you and would love to continue. Experienced your spirituality. And I can tell you, as a Pentecostal, particularly from the Black majority church, they would engage with the spirituality of what you offer. Spirituality is a massive thing for Black Pentecostals. And even the fact that you have an opportunity for pilgrimage, it's some, I've put this week on my Instagram because I always do that. And the amount of messages I've had, where's that? Oh my God, what is that? Pilgrimage. Do people actually do that still? I want to do that. And I don't want to scare you. We're not all going to come at once. But it shows that there's a desire there. You have beautiful spirituality. it's fascinating actually. And that just jumps to my spirit straight away. So I would say build those relationships. We can invite you as well to our spaces, have dinner together, and then see what comes from there.
Got a question. It's a bit of a tricky one, I think. It's still forming, but I guess my question is, how do we make sure that Black people don't get, well, not just Black people, people of color, don't get pigeonholed into doing work with us around racism? You know, if you're interested in the environment, come and be part of our climate change stuff. If you're interested in education, come and be part of that. And have you seen it happen? And do you have any advice on how to stop that happening?
Yeah, so how to say it? It's not the responsibility of Black, brown, Chinese, and also white is a color, just to say. It's not the responsibilities of those communities that you're trying to engage to then tell you, oh, I don't want to talk about that. That's the work that you would have to do within. So for instance, I speak a lot on homelessness because that's my vocation and passion. I've been asked to speak on racial justice because that's part of my job. So on that basis, I've said yes. But if it wasn't my area of expertise, I would have just said no. But it's also for the person who's asking. That's a work for you to do. It's a work for you to research who are the speakers or expertise in this area, and for you not to pigeonhole people. And that's why that workshop is about, before we do all the meta racial justice stuff, we have to do the work within. I hope that answers the question.
I know time's limited. This is a question about music and singing songs from. Sorry, I'm Gillian from Gillian from the Highlands Family Group. So a question about singing songs from the World Church. It's something that we have loved doing for years. I'm just slightly concerned about cultural appropriation and how that might appear to somebody who hasn't been within the community for a long time. If we sing a song from South Africa and acknowledge where it's come from and the people from whom it's come, are we treading on toes? Are we being insensitive?
Well, cultural appropriation is when you don't acknowledge and credit. So if you're doing that, that's fine. One more question?
Dennis Neville, West Midlands Family Group. It's more of a just wanting to just affirm what you've strongly affirmed what you say, really. I mean, I've been involved in lots of projects over the years, projects to do this, projects to do that. But what I found is just talking to people that you meet, your neighbours, or you know, the people you meet on the street. I once, you know, the people live next door to you. That's what matters, and just listening to people. That's what I found time and time again, and big and great things have come from that. I mean, in our town, it's not me, but someone I know very well spoke to someone who in the town that was just sitting around the town, a refugee. Found that person was in real trouble, invited them to their home, said you can stay here, and then thought, well, there must be other people like this, and we've got a big group called the Welcome Group.
I love that, and I own a community. Please remember that you are countercultural and a prophetic witness, particularly in Western society, which is so individualistic. You echo or resemble or embody a collectivism that society is crying out for. And I think the more you share that with communities, God will bless you dearly.
Shamara, thank you. You've brought us an openness and a generosity and a passionate, radical message, which as a companion walking alongside us, having only joined us 2 days ago through that very rough ferry, you've understood us in a way that we never will understand ourselves. And I'm deeply grateful to you for that. There is so much to take from what you've shared with us. I know we'll be able to share both the document and the PowerPoint. I can imagine more than half of you are thinking, well, we'll do this exercise in our family groups. We'll take this one-to-one process and use it as part of our accounting process. It will enrich all of our relationships. Talking of relationships, we've already talked about a possible pilgrimaging program. We've talked about a companion program where Shamara, you might companion us in different ways. There's so much more. Thank you so much.